Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Capital Pathways, Investing in CCS Technologies. We're fortunate to have a group of experts with us today who bring perspectives from policy, finance, and product development. To let you know a little bit about the USEA, the U.S. Energy Association, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that brings together public and private energy stakeholders from around the world. We serve as a platform for collaboration, knowledge exchange, and technical assistance, helping to advance energy access and security, both in the US and internationally. Our members span government, industry, and academia, and we partner closely with agencies like the US Department of Energy. The Promoting Consensus on CCUS and Clean Fossil Energy Technologies program focuses on building dialogue and shared understanding around carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as well as other clean energy systems. Our goal is to bring together a wide range of stakeholders to identify areas of alignment and practical paths forward through webinars, workshops, and briefings that help shape smart, actionable policy grounded in technology and economic reality. To let you know a little bit about the webinar, this webinar will last about an hour and a half, 45 minutes for opening remarks, and 45 minutes for audience questions. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat below, and we'll answer them during the second half. This session will be recorded, and it will be available on our website within 24 hours. Next slide, please, Sonia. Now, before we get into our speakers and everything they have to say, let's start by providing a little bit of definitions for people who are unfamiliar with this topic. So when we talk about CCUS, colloquially known as carbon capture, use, and storage, we're referring to the process of capturing carbon dioxide from power plants and industrial sources, things like cement, steel, and ethanol, and using it or permanently storing it underground. Storage is typically done through injection into deep geological formations using what's called a Class 6 well, a permitting designation under EPA's Underground Injection Control Program. For some projects, particularly those using oil and gas operations, carbon is used in a process called enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, where CO2 is injected into depleted oil fields to push out remaining reserves. Those involve EPA Class 2 wells. There is also a growing industry of using CO2 to make products like fuels, chemicals, and even vodka for those who are interested. An offshoot of CCUS, direct air capture, or DAC, pulls CO2 straight from the atmosphere, rather than from an emitting source. It's a newer application of established technology with roots not only in CCUS, but also in scrubbing CO2 out of the air in submarines and space, but is increasingly part of the conversation. Next slide, please. Now, turning to policy and capital side, CCS is not a new concept, but it has never been financed or deployed at this scale before. The backbone of financial support for CCS is the 45Q tax credit, which was first enacted back in 2008. It's been expanded several times, most significantly by the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which raised the value of the credit to $85 per ton for geological storage. It's also $180 for DAC with storage, $60 per ton with enhanced oil recovery, $130 for DAC with enhanced oil recovery. These credits have been key for project finances across the country. As of the time of this webinar, the 45Q remains in place. However, recent legislative developments have made some noteworthy changes, notably indexing for inflation, which has been scheduled to begin in 2027, has now been delayed to 2028. There's also new movements in Congress to raise the credit for EOR to match the storage rate. Another significant topic of discussion will be transferability, a mechanism that allows developers to sell their tax credits to third parties, which lowers the cost of and improves the efficiency of financing. Some further challenges that we're witnessing, despite 45Q, the CCUS industry faces financing challenges presented by higher interest rates and inflation, which have significantly raised the cost of project development. Add to that long permitting timelines, and developers face many hurdles to bring projects online. With these challenges in mind, today's conversation will unpack how we continue to invest in projects. That means figuring out how to leverage private investment alongside federal support, create capital structures that attract long-term financing, speed up permitting, and reduce regulatory uncertainty. We're looking forward to having a lively and practical discussion. With that, let's turn to our panelists, who will give a deep dive into the trenches by analyzing cost, shaping policy, and driving investment in CCS systems nationwide. I would like to turn this over to Michael Downey from the EFI Foundation.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. I will go ahead and pull up my screen. All right. So thank you first to USCA, in particular to Crystal and to Alex for hosting us. My name is Michael Downey. I'm with the EFI Foundation. And I also want to highlight my colleague, Sonia Griffin here, who was instrumental in putting together the analysis that I'll be talking through today and this in today's materials. The purpose of this conversation or I guess to start, I want to talk about an analysis that EFI released a couple months ago, looking at the state of deployment of CCS in the US, some of the challenges that CCS is facing around costs and permitting, as Crystal just mentioned. But my goal here is really to set the table for the conversation that we'll be having. We'll talk in my remarks around kind of the state of CCS coming into the year, acknowledging that a lot has changed in the policy environment in the past few weeks, let alone the past few months. But I know some of my fellow panelists will be going a little bit deeper into the weeds on the current state of play. So I'm hoping to provide that baseline for everyone. So to get started, Crystal really framed it up well at the top. In particular, her point that carbon capture is not a new technology. It's been deployed successfully in the US and around the world for over 50 years. And so when we talk about CCS being new or unproven, what we're really talking about is deploying CCS in new applications. So historically in the US, we've traditionally deployed CCS in applications like natural gas processing or ethanol production. But there are a lot of other industries where CCS needs to be a major player in helping us to decarbonize. And so the second point that I want to focus on is thinking about CCS not as a competitor to other clean energy technologies, but really a complement. Because in many instances, we have a fairly large installed industrial base that we need to decarbonize. And CCS often provides the most cost-effective approach. So that helps us to reduce emissions. It helps us to ensure affordability, but it also helps to protect the industries and the jobs that communities are reliant upon with these existing facilities. So back to the point from the beginning around applying CCS in new applications. When we think about deploying in a new industry, we have to remember that the more times we deploy, the more that we learn, and thus the more the costs come down. So when we think about early stage demonstrations, we can't be satisfied with just one and assume that all will be well. We need to be methodical about how we support that deployment across multiple iterations. So stepping back for a second, a couple of years ago, EFI put out an analysis looking at the bankability of CCS, in particular, how to get investors to yes for investing in CCS projects in power and heavy industry. Within that analysis, we identified 5 major pathways that we believe need to be addressed to get investors more confident with the technology and willing to deploy capital at the scale that we need. So some of those areas are making sure that there's complementary incentives, so ensuring that these various applications have sufficient revenues to be profitable for investors, and especially for those first-of-a-kind pioneering projects that are often far riskier, far more expensive, making sure that they have a little extra to be able to incentivize those early iterations. Crystal talked a little bit about transferability, so we want to make sure that the 45Q tax credit is effective and usable so that those developers who are hoping to take advantage of the credit really can benefit from the maximum value of it, and that taxpayers are getting the full value when those dollars are paid through tax credits. We also want to make sure that when Department of Energy and others are supporting public demonstrations of these projects, that the public is benefiting from those learnings so that the next developer and the next and the next can benefit from those learnings, and we can keep moving down that cost curve. looking at number 4, we want to make sure that these projects can actually be built. So looking at how we modernize our permitting to ensure that the projects can be deployed. And then finally, we want to make sure that the communities who are hosting these facilities genuinely benefit, both in terms of improved air quality, as well as financially from the investments that are being made. So the analysis that EFI just released a couple months ago aimed to look at what's changed over the past 2 years, and in many instances, what's not. So to start, let's look at the cost of CCS. Unfortunately, the story here is not a great news story. Over the past few years, due to high inflation, high interest rates, that increase in the value of 45Q that Crystal talked about at the beginning has largely been offset by inflation and interest rates. We're seeing that a lot of different applications are still the costs for an nth of a kind. So once we get to those mature deployments are still above that $85 threshold. And the first of a kind deployments are even more out of the money. So what you see here on the chart is in the dark bars, those are our estimates from 2023. And the lighter bars focus on what's changed over the past couple of years. Now, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a nice provision built in that indexed the value of 45Q to inflation. But unfortunately, there was a delay with implementing, or with when that indexing would come into effect. So it'll be indexed to the 2025 base year this year, which means that all of those inflation, or all of that inflation is already built into the price. So just for to understand what could happen, EFI in our analysis looked at what would happen if 45Q had been indexed to 2020 rather than to 2025. And what we found was it would increase the value by a small but meaningful amount, which, while not putting any additional applications kind of over the fence in terms of bankability, it helps to close that delta, making it easier for the developers and the projects that are hoping to deploy these projects. Now, you may have looked at the left side of that chart and said, hey, we've got applications like natural gas processing, hydrogen production, ethanol that are in the money today. Why not just focus on deploying there? And we absolutely should be as fast as we can. That said, the applications that really have a meaningful impact on emissions in the US are ones like coal power, natural gas powered plants, natural gas boilers. And so for CCS to really make a meaningful dent in our nation's emissions, we need to look at those applications that are out of the money today, but are crucial to decarbonize as we move forward. Now, I don't want to de-emphasize the need to move quickly on those applications that are in the money today. But it's not just the costs that we have to think about. It's also, back to my point at the top, permitting. How do we make sure that these projects can actually be deployed? What you see here on the slide right now is the status of Class 6 permitting. So the primary mechanism for storing CO2 currently. The EPA has unfortunately moved a little bit too slowly in getting Class 6 wells approved. You'll see here that as of January, 95% of active applications were still in that technical review phase, which means even for the projects that were able to capture the carbon profitably, they still need a place to put it. And so we have seen some movement here. You'll see a few clippings that I grabbed from the past year. On the top left, you'll see that there has been movement to help or to enable some states to have primacy for issuing Class 6 permits. So that means that EPA delegates that authority to the states. We now have 4 states with primacy. That includes Wyoming, Louisiana, North Dakota, and now West Virginia. And there are a number of states that have applications and are moving. So we're hoping that we'll continue to see EPA move forward on allowing for greater primacy. Unfortunately, on the pipeline side, we're seeing some additional struggles. We've seen a couple states pass laws limiting eminent domain for carbon pipelines. A couple years ago, the Navigator pipeline, which was going to move captured carbon from ethanol plants in the Midwest, they unfortunately canceled the project, citing the unpredictable nature of regulatory and government processes. And then we've got the Summit pipeline, which this year faced some additional challenges, particularly with the rejection in South Dakota. That was also going to be moving captured carbon from ethanol plants. So we're hopeful that project will move forward, but it does face a very steep climb. Now, given these challenges around cost, permitting, it's fair to ask, where are we in terms of deploying carbon capture in the US? The Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, GCCSI, has a great report they put out last year that found that there were over 300 projects in the US that have been announced or in some level of development. So there is interest. But when we dug into those projects, what we unfortunately found is only about 15 or so were really making meaningful progress toward commercial scale deployments. And what we mean by material progress is significant movement on securing permits, securing offtake agreements for the captured carbon, conducting front-end engineering and design studies or FEED studies, securing the contractors and the technology vendors. And another thing that we found with these 15 is that the majority of them benefited from federal support, whether small grants through FEED studies or early pilot demonstrations. But there were also 5 projects in this list that were that received large-scale grants through the large-scale demonstration program funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, unfortunately, for those who have been tracking the news, DOE recently announced that they were going to cancel several of those awards, including plants for natural gas, combined cycle, cement, and in hydrogen. So while we've yet to hear any additional cancellations, it does certainly make the economics for those projects more challenging and could slow momentum toward building out those first-of-a-kind projects, which we then need second-of-a-kind and third-of-a-kind so that we can get those costs down and eventually be able to achieve scaled deployment. Now, a lot of this, these are challenges, no question about it. But, but we do see a lot of opportunities for policymakers to continue advancing support for CCS, particularly for some of these early pioneering applications. And for those who are quickly scanning this page, you may see a theme. All 3 of the groups that we've identified, Congress, the executive branch, states, all have a role to play for accelerating permitting. Because again, the financial part of CCS is crucial, but so is the ability to get these projects built. A few other recommendations that we wanted to highlight include strengthening 45Q. So back to that point around inflation indexing, we'd like to see some movement there, though, as Crystal highlighted in her upfront comments, we're seeing that move the other way. So we're hoping that there might be some flexibility on the inflation adjuster. In the future, we'd like to see additional support for those early stage pioneering projects, but we recognize that may not be as likely in this current environment. For the executive branch, even though there's some skepticism around supporting these large-scale demonstration programs, we've heard the Secretary of Energy voice a strong support for DOE's role in early stage R&D. So continuing to support these early concepts and rapid prototyping so that we can bring up those technologies that might help us to reduce costs more quickly. And then on the state side, we recognize that supporting the supply side of CCS is crucial, but so is creating that demand pool. So looking at how state policies can expand existing clean energy targets. So I think renewable portfolio standards, perhaps expanding those to include firm power resources that are enabled with CCS. And then also trying to make sure that through engagement, we are again, trying to benefit the communities who will be hosting, because a lot of the challenges that we see on the permitting side come from communities who are not seeing that they're benefiting from these projects, and they really do need to see those benefits. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'm eager to get into more of the details during our Q&A. But I think, Crystal, back to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that comprehensive discussion. So now I would like to pass this over to Jeffrey Brown from the EFI Foundation.
I'm going to go ahead and share slides. And Michael and Sonia, you guys did great work, and thank you. And for those of you who haven't been involved, when these guys come up with a piece of research, it is a year-long labor of love. Well done. So let me share this. Bear with me. I'm going to attempt to, pardon me? Yeah. All right. How are we doing on sharing the slideshow?
I'm afraid we've got your Google webpage pulled up right now.
All right, that doesn't work much. All
We
right.
can pass it over to Sonia.
Oh, yeah, just give me a half a second here. Slideshow from beginning. You'll have to pardon me. My daughter got married this weekend, and not all the brain cells have come back. How is this? Better? Okay.
That's better. We can see.
Well, thank you, guys. I'm Jeff Brown from Brown Brothers Energy and Environment. And here you go. Taking a bit from Monty Python, so I know we've seen some ups and downs in the House bill, and hopefully some of it will get remedied in the Senate. And we've had some pretty tough inflationary and interest rate headwinds the last few years. But I would say 'tis but a scratch. There's a lot that we will be able to do. But first of all, what has the goal been? Because when we look at policy, the question is, what were we trying to get done? And the question is, are we trying to incentivize CCS enough to get at scale, or just to get some wins on the board? It's a lot harder to get to scale. What would it take to get to scale? Let's look at some of the modeling. Even if we don't get boosts in 45Q, what projects are well positioned? There's been more talk about EOR and transferability. So, more or less 5 topics in about 5 minutes. I just wanted to remind people, again, it takes a lot more to get CCS at scale, meaning, well, here, it's the NPC report, National Petroleum Council, at the end of the prior Trump administration. And the goal of this report was to talk about scale. So if you look at this graph, they're looking at, say, up to the first billion of US stationary emissions, whereas, our current carbon capture might be in, the 5 million ton range in the industrial side. So they were looking at what does it take to get to scale, which is a lot. I'm just going to reprise the chart that Michael showed and Sonia to say, of all the discussion, of all the projects that were getting done, when they looked, and I agree with this, there were only about 15 projects, and of those that were real, as opposed to talked about. Of those, these baby blue ones are mostly hydrogen export from the Gulf in the form of ammonia abroad. And those worked without changing 45Q, because the US has cheap natural gas and it's easy to make cheap ammonia. Of the ones we care about in heavy industry, on the right side, DOE wiped out the 2 best natural gas projects and the cement project. So, that really put a hole in the effort. What do I mean by a hole in the effort? As Michael showed, there's a huge gap between first of a kind and nth of a kind. So even if we manage to get 45Q repaired enough to stabilize and do a lot of nth of a kind projects at scale, that doesn't get us from first to nth. From first to nth takes some serious government policy, and we just wiped out that policy. So that's an issue. Let's go to the next one. This is drawn from work that I was able to cooperate with Jessie Solark and her colleagues at the Carbon Capture Coalition on. So let me just summarize what this chart did. Was it looked, and it said today's 45Q level, per ton sequestered, captured and transported and sequestered in geologic sequestration, the payment is $85 a ton. So what would it take to really get a lot of projects done, like at scale, for nth of a kind cost levels? So we've gotten from first to nth. And we looked at 4 cases because not every project is the same. We looked at kind of the high and low end of the cost and say that's the 400 tons per year. That's $400 per ton per year of equipment capability to capture and storage, right? So it's like the cost per megawatt of a power plant. So 400 and 600, and profitable corporations that can use the tax credits easily, and standalone projects that need to use, quote, tax equity. We'll talk about that later. But on average, it took about $130 a ton. But to really bring in the highest cost projects, and for other than the most profitable corporate owners who can easily use tax benefits, you kind of need 153. If you wanted just to do the cheap projects with the richest corporations, maybe you could get by with 109. Either way, a fair bit larger than the 85, but it's easier to get 109 through Congress than 153. So the average of 130 is kind of misleading, but that gives you an over-under of how far we are away at $85. Okay, 'tis but a flesh wound. All is not lost. What I wanted to do here is just talk about what are the kind of special cases. Okay, so maybe we can't get to scale, but we can get some wins up on the board. How will we do that? Well, if you bucket it, there's some existing and cheap projects. Many of them already made sense at $85. Theoretically, that's assuming you can get a pipeline and you can find storage, and that. So theoretically, there's about $25 or $30 headroom profitability, except as Michael pointed out, projects like Navigator and Summit, despite having an easy time getting the CO2, have a hell of a time moving it because of our poor pipeline regulations. Some projects, greenfield, new build and cheap, right? Not addressing existing emissions, but still. Blue ammonia from the Gulf of Mexico with a technology called autothermal reforming. Export ammonia to Japan to substitute for coal and power plants. So it's a good thing for the world. It just doesn't reduce U.S. emissions. None have been completed, but they're on the boards and they're not that technically difficult. And then we get to some of the things that were hurt by the cancellations, but let's just say out of the money but motivated. Certainly, a lot of the global companies in cement, like Heidelberg, have global carbon goals. They are motivated independently of what incentives we will give. And cement, in terms of the industrial projects, is on the low end of capture cost. There are very high CO2 concentrations at very large sources. So those were wounded, but I think those can come back if those companies really stick to their global goals. And really hard, but motivated in special situations. Ordinarily, it's hard to do gas power project carbon capture, but certainly Calpine, whose 2 projects were canceled, still is pretty motivated, and they may persist. So these are some of the more promising little gems in the landscape. I'm going to just very quickly finish with 2 things. One is, look, a lot of people have said, we just hate fossil fuels. We hate enhanced oil recovery. Let me explain why. So just suspend environmental objections for a second. Why is it easier to get wins on the board? at today's levels with enhanced oil recovery, it is really basic. Money in beats money out. So let's just compare two columns. One is carbon capture and geologic sequestration. That's how you earn the current $85. To the right is CCS and EOR if there were parity, right? Same price, same 45Q, either way. Either way, it costs $100 to capture. With a change, which has been proposed, either way, if you put a ton underground, you get $85. Now, the issue is if you want to do geologic storage, people differ on how much it costs and where, and it could be $10 in Mississippi, or it could be $40 in Kansas, but pretend the cost of geologic sequestration over under is kind of $20. That's in red, that's cash out. If you add the numbers in that column, you're $35 in the hole. On the other hand, if you were selling it as an input to enhanced oil recovery, which basically uses CO2 to dry clean remaining oil out of an existing, already built oil reservoir, kind of like recycling the old oil fields, you get paid $20 because it's useful. So that's a $40 swing, 20 in instead of 20 out per ton. So that's why it works. And I'll just briefly say, if you want to have the argument about environmental benefits, we could do that later. But fundamentally, if you were going to have fossil power plants anyway, and if you were going to make oil somewhere because we still have internal combustion engines, you can do the math and basically you're neutral. The CO2 you catch from the power plant more or less is counteracted by the CO2 from oil you produce, but you do sequester a ton. And that differs, by a ton from the same system without CO2 EOR. And I'm going to wrap up on, this will come up from others. I talked about tax equity, but look, this is obscure. If you are not a tax geek like me, you didn't spend a quarter century on Wall Street, this will go over your head. US tax is insane. But look, let me just briefly summarize how easy or hard it is to use 45Q is as important as the dollar amount. It is not cash money, typically, right? It is a tax credit. Tax credits are only useful if you have a federal tax bill, because it's like a coupon, cents off on your tax bill, okay? CO2 or CCS projects, typically on their own, don't become federal taxpayers for 10 or 20 years. How come? They're big, they have tons of depreciation and lots of debt, and the depreciation and interest deductions wipe out their taxable income. So they can't use the tax credits. They're not paying the IRS anything. A coupon for cents off doesn't do them any good. Tax equity, right? This is the thing you've all heard of. Yeah, it sounds complicated. Really, all it does is it allows a high taxpayer party to join the project as a partner, a real live investor, and for the tax credits to be disproportionately siphoned off to that partner for a period of time, but enough for that high tax-paying partner to very usefully use up the 45Qs, defraying its tax obligation. Point is, though, this is a real partnership ownership locked in for a lot of years, and it's really inflexible. And if the person who thinks he's a taxpayer invests and all of a sudden starts having a bunch of terrible years in their business, those tax credits are now useless to that partner. Transferability was a great thing in IRA. It gave that partner whose tax situation had changed a bailout option. It could sell the tax credits to another party that year in the spot market. Fabulous. It's not so worried. Well, yeah, that's the only reason, transferability, the only reason that even with all the new credits showing up from IRA, the tax equity market was able to absorb and accommodate some of those. So just unequivocally, sorry, I employ myself, I can speak freely. Wiping out transferability would be absolutely terrible. It's terrible directly for the deals, and it is terrible because the U.S. already has, in the U.S. and outside the U.S., a terrible reputation for instability in incentives and mostly now instability in tax policy. And all we have done is just add to our lousy reputation by yet again changing the rules. So, yeah, this is a really high priority. Supposedly, the Senate's better on this than the House. God bless the Senate in that case. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that. Next, I would like to request Jesse Stolak from the Carbon Capture Coalition to be our next speaker.
Thanks, Crystal, and thanks to USCA and to Jeff and to EFI for the great report. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see that? Okay. So I'm going to speak just a little bit about how the work that EFI and Jeff have done, EFI's work and the work that Jeff has done for the Carbon Capture Coalition has informed our own policy priorities, especially in this Congress with the very active conversation around tax. Before I get started, I'll briefly introduce the coalition if you're not already familiar with the organization. And so we are the national organization working to build broad federal policy support for the nationwide deployment of carbon management technologies. And carbon management is really a term of art, which for us is inclusive of all the technologies that manage, abate, or remove CO2. And it includes carbon capture at industrial and power facilities, carbon removal directly from the atmosphere, as well as the supportive infrastructure, including CO2 transport, carbon reuse, and geologic storage. And so we are a coalition, and our process is grounded in consensus of our membership, which really drives forward our policy priorities. Our membership is incredibly diverse and spans not only the sectors looking to deploy and commercialize these technologies, but also national conservation and energy policy nonprofit organizations, as well as labor unions that are made up of the men and women who will build and operate these projects. So, and then just briefly, the coalition is part of a broader ecosystem of carbon management policy development and advocacy led by the Great Plains Institute. So the coalition, as I mentioned, is exclusively federally focused, and we leverage the expertise and work of our colleagues who focus on policy development, engagement, and advocacy at the regional and state levels. So others have covered this kind of like the why carbon management, why should the US be investing in and deploying these technologies, but I'll put our own spin on this, which I think is relevant to the discussion later on the policy landscape for these technologies. So I would say in our members' views, the nationwide deployment of carbon management technologies is critical to maintaining domestic energy and industrial production, boosting U.S. global competitiveness in these markets, international markets that are increasingly demanding cleaner materials and products, as well as retaining a high-wage job space and achieving necessary emissions reductions. And we would say that deployment of these technologies squarely fits within the administration's priority to provide reliable, affordable energy for American businesses, industrial production, and families. And it has been really a rare bright spot in energy policy in the U.S. over the past nearly 2 decades. Bringing Democrats and Republicans alike together in the U.S. Congress to work to support these technologies. And I think that's why we're seeing such strong results. And I know we'll talk about it later, but in the current One Big Beautiful Bill Act that is moving through the U.S. Congress. But why we're here today is that inflation and other economic factors have created headwinds for deploying these technologies that were really not expected or anticipated at the time when the most recent enhancements to the 45Q tax credit were put into place in 2022. And just one more note on the Carbon Capture Coalition, we've had our fingerprints on nearly all major carbon management legislation, stretching back to the transformational update to the 45Q Act, or 45Q in the 2018 Future Act, as well as appropriations for project demonstration and deployment, including most recently and the infrastructure law, and then, of course, the most recent enhancements to the tax credits. And today we work on a broad agenda of priorities across legislative, tax, regulatory, implementation, and communications. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but if you walk away with any message from my presentation today, it would be that 45Q works. We've seen that it's already driving significant investment across the nation, and it is the foundational market signal for project deployment, especially in those sectors where the tax credit provides sufficient investment to deploy the technologies. So I'd say if we can preserve 45Q and unlock permitting roadblocks, we will see significant deployment of these technologies in those sectors that Michael and Jeff discussed in the next several years. At the same time, we know that the tax credit in its current iteration is falling short of what we need to see a nationwide deployment across heavy emitting sectors. And so as kind of the market signal, 45Q is driving significant investment across the country, already an estimated 77.5 billion in investments. And that's through the end of last year, really across the country, across sectors. And then lastly, before I move into our policy recommendations, it's important to note, in addition to the significant economic investments in communities, there is a significant workforce component here with these technologies, and that stems from both keeping existing facilities online as well as creating new jobs in construction and operations of these facilities. So getting to our policy recommendations to bolster the potential for carbon management, you can find all of this in our policy blueprint, which is on our website. And the coalition's policy blueprint offers a framework for the Congress and administration for deployment of these technologies over the next decade. It contains recommendations that spans 4 topic areas, including ensuring investment certainty or tax policy, market development, transport and storage infrastructure, and next generation technology deployment. And so here's just a very high-level summary of some of our key priorities that we have been focusing on over the last 6 months, including defending and preserving the 45Q tax credit. I'll go a little more, and it's been discussed already, in indexing inflation for the 45Q tax credit, implementation of these really important recently passed provisions, as well as some key pieces on permitting reform. And so on the tax side, I would say our top priorities this Congress has been adjusting the tax credit for the base indexing year. As we've seen really the highest levels of inflation throughout the economy that impacted construction, materials costs, other things that really drove up the cost of deploying these technologies were in those years between 2020 and 2022. And so we have our recommendation to Congress is to use a base indexing year of 2021 that would reflect the marker bill to increase the credit values that was ultimately included in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was introduced in 2021. But we know that that's not going to be enough. If 45Q is the sole market driver of these technologies, and at this point it is, we need to see additional value for point source capture projects moving forward. And so just again on indexing inflation, if we did see an adjustment to the indexing inflation base year, so if they were to move the base year from 20 to 25, which it currently is in statute, to 2021, it would provide a 25% nominal value increase to the credit. And so, for example, the credit right now is $85 a ton for geologic storage for carbon captured from industrial and power facilities. But in today's dollar, because of inflation and other cost pressures, the value of the tax credit is actually about $68. So that would just really line up the tax credit with the original congressional intent behind 45Q. And then just quickly on permitting, kind of really goes hand in hand with making sure that the tax credit is working as intended. There's actually a lot, and I think there's a lot of bipartisan appetite and interest in working on permitting this Congress. And there's a lot that the broader carbon management community can do on permitting. So we need to see and work with the administration to finalize a lot of pieces on the regulatory front. So that includes regulatory clarity to store CO2 on federal lands, providing a pathway for CO2 storage on the outer continental shelf, and then modernizing safety mechanisms at PHMSA and building on really excellent safety standards that already exist in the industry. And what I would say as far as our permitting priorities, we've been focusing on timely and dependable decision-making for Class 6 well permits from the EPA and the creation of an optional federal siting authority pathway for CO2 pipelines, which importantly would not supersede the ability to go through a state-by-state process. And then just to tee up, I know that Christine is going to talk more about reconciliation, but again, 45Q has fared incredibly well in the budget reconciliation process. How the House bill only trimmed the transferability election for those projects, which Jeff talked about how important transferability is. And then in the Senate bill text that we have seen, at least the first iteration we saw released last week, it provides parity for end uses for CO2 capture from industrial and power plants. It does, unfortunately, move further back the indexing date. So that is going to, again, further erode the value of the tax credits slightly by adding that additional year. But we remain hopeful that they will address that before final passage. So with that, I'll turn it back to Crystal.
Thank you very much, Jessie. Now I would like to be able to pass this over to Christina Borowski from the Citizens for Responsible Energy Sustainability. I think I mispronounced missaid that.
Oh, good. I'm Christina Borowski. I'm vice president over at CRESS, which is Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. And I know you've just heard a lot about these credits in very, very big detail. And so what I'm hoping to do I think we might be a little over time too, Crystal, right? Or are we okay? We're okay on time? Okay. I just figured I would crystallize kind of 4 main areas based off of these previous presentations, just to give you a little bit of a view of what's going on the Hill, just so that folks can understand a little bit on the risk mitigation side. So I think one of the points that Jeffrey made on transferability is a very good one. One to which the Senate has adjusted the transferability provision. It was restored, which is excellent. I think, senators who had weighed in overarchingly in support of the tax credits are definitely responsible for that change. I would say that if your company utilizes transferability, I would make sure that your lobbyists in Washington are, continuing a drumbeat for its continued preservation. One of the political realities behind why transferability was kind of under scrutiny is some folks were essentially calling it a version of ESG. And so you had this movement from the conservatives in the House in order to strip out this provision. So it's very good that common sense and heads prevailed and it was placed back in. Jeffrey, did I say something interesting?
No, they actually said it was like ESG.
Yes, to paraphrase. I
good.
can send you the memo that it is pretty much called ESG into it. I think it's for people who don't understand how
Tax
projects
policy.
get financed. That's it. And I'm going right back in and saying, hey, fun facts, the biggest users of transferability are actually projects that are like smaller critical minerals. So, it's very silly, but it's definitely one of those things that got like a buzzword attached to it and then kind of took a second life of its own.
Just since I already almost had
Yeah.
during IRA, people said this was like, corporate welfare. If these quote, if these projects are so stupid they don't make money, then we shouldn't subsidize them. They make lots of money. They just don't make any money for federal tax purposes because of what Congress gave them before they gave them the tax credits. I mean, they're not stupid. They use what Congress already gave them. All right,
But,
next question.
and instead of it actually going to big banks, it actually goes to big box stores, which are helping fight inflationary pressures because costs are going up. So big box stores like it because it adds to their balance sheet. So I think that overarchingly transferability is like in an okay place. But the key thing is everyone needs to continue their advocacy. I know that that's definitely something that the CCC has been doing, but I would just say that until the president signs this bill into law, we need to acknowledge that there indeed are still things that could potentially backslide. And I would just say that until it's signed into law, let's be vigilant there. The second piece is, everyone's talking about, plussing up different provisions. Everyone's talking about getting fixes and technical fixes. Today, Senate Finance is going through the birdbath of the tax provisions. They're about 2 days behind schedule, so we're still going to see whether or not there were pieces that did indeed survive the birdbath. One of those provisions that I know that will be hotly examined is the Foreign Entity of Concern provisions, or FEOC, which I believe some of the previous presenters had talked about. So the FEOC provision is going to be one that is probably the most hotly contested. They're trying to figure out if it is indeed a policy measure or a revenue making measure. And so that's one where the jury is still out on, and we should know more in the next 24 hours or so. In parallel, what else are we looking at in terms of fixes? 45V, which is for hydrogen, was eliminated at the end of this year. And I mentioned this one as a lot of traditional oil and gas companies also have substantial interest in this hydrogen tax credit. The new score is about $7.25 billion. And just for perspective, that's an area where we're still not sure about whether or not there will be an appetite to find that much money to put the provision back in. So if we're fighting over, a couple billions here and there, I think it helps explain just the macro pressures that we're seeing in terms of increasing the availability of different credits or expanding or extending them. There are just a lot of financial pressures. That has kind of become even bigger this weekend because the banking committee had some provisions killed by the birdbath that they were hoping to use to bolster revenue. We've also had some provisions in SNAP, also birdbath. And what that means is that the macro amount of money to spend is getting tightened and tightened and tightened. And so it does make it very challenging in terms of maintaining what you've got for your credit, but also potentially being able to get any changes or fixes. If it costs money, you're kind of fighting now with competing ways of, making the bill come together. So it goes into conflict with the SALT folks in New York and California who have been asking for a SALT cap increase. It goes into conflict with people who don't want to cut Medicaid. And so what I'll just say in general is even if you feel like you're in a pretty stable place, until the bill is put into law, there's a lot of things that might become flexible. And so constant advocacy and education and continually having the conversation, I think is very important right now. The third piece that I was supposed to talk about is LPO. The Loan Program Office in the House bill, pretty much it preserved the existing authority. So if you had a loan out, it would be honored essentially, but it removes the amount of money that they would have for new or additional loans. In the Senate, we see a little bit of a different play. We see something called like an energy dominance fund. And it's similar, it's different. We don't exactly know how that's all going to land. I think that provision inside of energy and natural resources actively under birdbath today. And so we're going to see more over, the coming hours on how that fares. I do think that in general, this administration has had a little bit of a 180 in its posture on LPO. You've seen Secretary Wright say more positive things over the past few weeks. I think that, it's a very useful tool. And so I think from our organization, we're going to be out there, continually advocating for the preservation of those loan authorities. And then finally, kind of the political momentum, like what are we expecting over the next couple of days? I think that there is an effort to essentially get this out the door by July 4th. I think that's the hope and the prayer of the president. But things are taking a little longer than expected. So especially since the bird bath is several days behind, it means that any tweaks, changes, potential amendments are going to be truncated in a very, very short period of time. And so there's two theories of thought. There's some folks who think they're 100% going to meet the July 4th deadline and they're going to do everything that they humanly can to get there. And then there are the other people who say the faster you push people, the more value and rewarded you are for saying, hey, wait, stop. So I think this week, the idea is that the Senate starts to wrap things up. It seems like Speaker Johnson has told folks to come back before the 4th of July. But just based off of someone who's been in Washington for a while, they're going to try moving this thing. And as I say, sometimes bad behavior is rewarded. So we're going to see a lot of fireworks, a lot of surprises over the next week. And what I always recommend in those situations is, keep talking to staff, keep advocating on what you need preserved, and keep explaining why it is so important. Because if they don't hear about it, they forget about it, and then it's less likely that it gets protected. So hopefully that's a pretty good truncated summary of everything.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Christina. Now I would like to open this up to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So we've got several questions coming in. This one right here is interesting. If you had to choose between raising 45Q for EOR utilization, as proposed by the Senate GOP, or moving the base indexing year for inflation, which would you choose? And this is open to anyone to answer.
The one that gets me 50 votes. Joking.
I hate to say it, I would vote for EOR. And the reason is that the permits are easy to get. They're class 2. The states know what they're doing. And there are just existing large CO2 pipelines oriented towards the enhanced oil recovery industry. It's a commodity product, the CO2 is, and there are lots of buyers. And I personally have experience as the head of finance for a project that ended up failing because we couldn't get contracts from the EPC contractors. But literally the least of our worries was actually the CO2 because we were selling into Texas. It was a CO2 pipeline 5 miles from us. And there was a very large oil field that needed CO2 20 miles from us. And if that oil field failed, if it defaulted on its contract, there were others we could have sold to. So, the two things that are killing a lot of projects, a pipeline and a place to put the CO2 EOR, even at a reasonable price. We had a pipeline and a place to sell at a good price. What can I say?
Yeah, I can go next. So the reason the coalition, we made our top tax priority over the last 18 plus months, inflation indexing, is because fixing inflation indexing which was a definite choice that was made in the Inflation Reduction Act to put the 45Q, not only the date of inflation, but also the base date so late compared to other tax credits, is because if we fix that, that's something that affects the entire industry. And so kind of the thinking like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? We are very grateful for the leadership of Senator Brass and others who have been supporting parity for end use. And I think, the business case is it provides a lot of flexibility, right, in terms of choosing what you're going to do. And another reason that we had previously been focusing on parity for carbon utilization for products is, in talking to those project developers, they came to us and said, look, nobody's going to want to do business with us because they're automatically paying a tax to do a carbon reuse project, right, relative to geologic storage. And so our preferred base indexing year is 2021. But obviously any, movement there would be positive in our minds.
Yeah. Hey, Jesse, by the way, I mean, that's a very good decision. But, if you ask me, hey, you get food or water, I guess I choose water because I know I'll die in 2 days without the water. So if you really put a gun to my head, I was going, at least EOR helps a few projects get on the boards. Yeah, but it's pretty unsatisfactory without the inflation adjustment.
Thank you. One of our questions here. If the 45V H2 phases out after 2025 remains, do you foresee a significant growing market and demand for 45Q credits for H2 projects?
So I think in this instance, when we look at IRS guidance, they're pretty clear that projects have to select whether they're going to draw from 45V or 45Q. And so in this instance, I could see some additional interest in 45Q credits as projects either look at 45V and as it goes away, or look at the guidance as it currently stands today, which is fairly hard to comply with. And see that 45Q, even though it's not as user friendly as say the wind and solar credits, could still be a very appealing option. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see some of those applications that are in the money today continue to move forward and be able to take advantage of the $85, assuming that we're not able to achieve indexing using an earlier base year.
Hey, Crystal, piling on, by the way, on the hydrogen, the 45V was really designed to make hydrogen, using electrolyzers. In fact, the people who changed 45V midway through the legislative process said they specifically did it to keep the carbon capture projects from using 45V. So there was never going to be a lot of crossover between them. It was, your chance of succeeding with 45V when you were in like blue hydrogen was next to zero.
I would say, though, to your point, Jeffrey, that there have been some adjustments to the GREET model, which has made it more favorable for at least a few blue hydrogen projects. So while that was probably the intent of the Biden administration, now that we're kind of seeing some of these blue hydrogen projects that are relying on 45V speak up, I would just say that that's one thing that I would say is a changing dynamic over probably the past 6-7 months. That I would just flag.
Okay, so you got me. I'm a geezer and I'm out of date. Sorry. That was great.
I am a young punk who just follows blue hydrogen and has a wonderful blue hydrogen white paper about how the failure to preserve 45V could cost up to $12 billion of GDP loss and also 60,000 jobs. So we like jobs, we like GDP growth. So we'll just flag that change that is more modern and recent. But I would say a year ago, absolutely, there was definitely movement away from the non-green technologies, but that's been somewhat adjusted.
A very strong argument right there. Another question we have here. Can you discuss whether the private sector will step up and provide the financial and technical support to replace what is being withdrawn at the federal level?
So I'll jump in on this one. And one area that we explored a bit in our analysis and then in follow-up conversations was, well, to go back, Jeff framed up his argument around, is the goal to get some wins on the board, or is the goal to get to scale? And while it is true that to get to scale, we're really going to need to either make the incentives higher, or we're going to need to compel installation of CCS. But we do see some opportunities, particularly within the power sector, where some companies who may have some additional willingness to pay might be interested in pursuing CCS. In particular, we've heard from a number of data center developers, the large companies that have said we need new power, where right now we see natural gas as the fastest way to market. But we do want to stay true to our carbon goals. A framing that I've been hearing regularly is this idea of including a carbon option, meaning installing those new natural gas plants in such a way that they're CCS ready, that when the economics work out or when the policy environment shifts, it's as easy as possible to add CCS to those existing facilities. So while it may mean a phased implementation where we have new generating capacity built out first, and then we have to go back and add additional infrastructure, I do see a potential pathway that would enable us to have some hope, even if in the near term the future is a little bit more questionable.
Yeah, I can just add to that and say I do think that the hyperscalers and the data and AI demand that's really driving a lot of the near-term electricity demand increase. I think that is a huge opportunity for CCS, and to Michael's point, the hyperscalers, their top priorities are speed, cost, and carbon. And so how do we ensure that those facilities are carbon capture ready, I think is a really smart question. And so, it is really disappointing to see the DOE take a step back there. And I think Jeff raised this earlier, right? It's, in my mind, some of those projects very well may go forward. They have already gone through very rigorous review by DOE technical staff, and there's cost shares involved. So those projects may be able to secure, private financing. I think the bigger question is, this just further kind of risks the US as a good place to do business, as the federal government as a good, reliable partner, because if, what business is going to want to spend the time and investment to work with the federal government, knowing that the rug could be pulled out from under them at any point, if there is an administration change. So I think there are some bright spots there, but yeah, it's just incredibly disappointing to see kind of that step taken.
Thank you, Jesse. Jeffrey, I have a question for you now. Is there an environmental case for EOR?
Oh, you're on mute, Jeff.
Hopefully, and Crystal, thanks, because I was going to talk about this and didn't. Can you guys see this slide? And this is what I actually show my students at Stanford because they're a little bit skeptical on CO2 EOR. But I would say the original name of the Carbon Capture Coalition was the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, because we didn't know about geologic sequestration. So I just did a real simple example and said, and basically, if we're not going to have fossil fuels and we don't make oil anymore, then fine. But if we are going to make oil and burn it, and we are going to have some fossil fuel plants, even gas, here's the argument. And I just took left side, right side, simplified, but these numbers are pretty good. So left side is today's base case. We have a lot of gas plants. And so if 3 megawatt hours from a gas plant, and we put a ton of CO2 up the stack. And for reasons I'll explain, I'd say, okay, and how about also let's make 1.8 barrels of oil. When we burn that, that's another 0.9 tons of CO2. Okay, fine. So we've got 1.9 tons and we've got product of 3 megawatt hours and 1.8 barrels. You can have the same system here. So on the right, same power plant, we just capture 90% of the CO2. So we've got 0.1 ton instead of 1 going up the stack. The 0.9 gets injected for CO2 EOR. Given typical productivity in the oil field, that 0.9 tons produces about 1.8 barrels. And the 1.8 barrels is 0.9 tons of CO2. So it's basically the right side You've got 0.1 plus 0.9 is 1 ton going in the air. The left side, 1.9 tons. Okay, which do you like better? If you were gonna make the oil anyway, you might as well do the one on the right. And my last point is, the oil I'm talking about is nice, light oil like West Texas. In fact, a lot of the marginal oil we make is from the tar sands and similar oil sources. And so actually, the oil we're displacing, probably that 0.9 tons is, should also be counting the fact that we would be displacing ugly stuff or like Mayan crude from Venezuela or Mexico. But anyway, this is simple enough, and I'd take the one on the right. I'd rather not do any of it, but given the real world, I'd take the one on the right.
Well, thank you for the explanation, Jeffrey. I would like to go back to one of our audience questions right here. What happens if 45Q eventually goes away? Should it become a permanent tax credit?
I can go first. That's the $1 million question, and something that the coalition kind of grapples with every 2 years when we go through our policy blueprint. I would say that, right, in the US, absent some sort of regulatory framework, and Michael alluded to this, 45Q is the only incentive to capture CO2. So right now it's free to pollute. Essentially, there are, state frameworks, but at the federal level, that's the case. And it's a very expensive technology at this moment, to install and to operate. And so, why I kind of laugh is because we continually have this conversation, but we are focused on those near-term policy needs over the next, several years, what we can accomplish over a Congress. So, I think absent other mechanisms, we will need a price to incentivize the deployment of this technology. So who knows where we will be in 2033 when the tax credit commence construction date expires. And I think that's, those are questions that we see for kind of later on down the line, but it does, the time limited sense of the tax credit, and particularly with geologic storage, when there are no other markets for, the quote unquote product, what other drivers are there? And so, we've been focused on market development and other pieces, but it does raise the question of what happens after that date.
And I would add that when we look at US history, every major pollution control technology has received some sort of policy support. And that's sometimes financial incentives to stimulate deployment. In other cases, it's mandatory regimes requiring that these pollution technologies be installed. So as we think about the variety of policy supports, it doesn't necessarily just need to be incentives. And in fact, the more that we mandate technologies like these, the less that we need to incentivize them financially. So there's an option for a nice balance in terms of how we think about the policy regimes to support what, as Jesse said, is currently a pollutant that's free to emit.
Yeah, look, as Michael said, think about it. What is the business case for scrubbing sulfur dioxide out of coal plants? And there isn't a business case. We just don't like acid rain. What's the business case for not dumping raw sewage into the streams? Well, we kind of like to be able to swim in the streams. What's the business case for subsidizing not sticking CO2 in the air? Oh yeah, we don't like CO2 in the air. So the idea that being clean is going to be cheaper than being dirty, it doesn't really pass muster for end of the pipe solutions.
Just to take it a step back, it's also not necessarily like the United States requesting this, right? It's if we want to export it competitively, if we want ours to be the fuel source that they want, they will pay a premium, because even if the United States doesn't want to put those same requirements, they want to trace how clean the fuels that they're using are and how clean the products they are using. So regardless of whether or not Republicans like sticks, we're seeing those sticks appear in markets across the world. And, that's just something where it's like, do I want to be globally competitive? In which case, if I see in the horizon these technologies just becoming the base for business operation because other, continents are asking for it, I either have the opportunity to take that really, really clean oil from Texas and make it even cleaner, or I'm going to fall behind on, other nations who aren't as environmentally, stringent, who are investing in this technology. So there's a strategic good for the United States to have this technology accelerated at scale and deploy it at scale, because if we're able to do that, it really does improve kind of that global exportability.
Yeah, Chrissy, building on your case, if you take LNG from the Gulf Coast going to Europe, competing with Russian pipeline gas, if they ever turn the pipeline back on, the LNG has a higher carbon footprint because you use a ton of gas and the attendant CO2 emissions to squish the CO2 down and refrigerate it to make it into LNG. You don't have that in a pipeline. So you have the ridiculous situation that the US LNG was getting clobbered with the carbon adjustment and the Russian gas, and the pipeline wasn't. Leave aside the methane leaks, and it's just yeah, it's the rest of the world, even if we want to be our own little island.
And to that end, when we think about which projects we're moving forward, going back to that pie chart, we saw a number of projects that were ammonia for export. And so to Christina's point, these are ammonia projects that are going to markets that have higher requirements. And so they need to be able to demonstrate that they have a lower carbon intensity.
Thank you all. Our next question here would be, what assumptions around storage efficiency are you included in the COR analysis? It's common for CO2 to be produced alongside oil and gas, especially following breakthrough of CO2 at the production wells, resulting in less than 100% of CO2 stored in credits received.
It's actually not very common. The CO2 is expensive. It's really expensive, and it is recycled. So I guess the first thing is most people think we put the CO2 down, oil comes up, the CO2 must come up again. Not true. You have big surface facilities that strip out the CO2 and shove them back down. If there's CO2 breakthrough, that just means there's a badly completed well in a CO2 EOR operation. But the same occurs in primary oil and primary gas. The main point is in CO2 EOR, you have a huge motivation to stop that leak because it's expensive and you're buying it. You have much less of an incentive to avoid CO2 leaks around the casing in primary oil and gas.
Thank you very much for that. Another question we have right here. How do you bring more capital for capture developers to accelerate capture development?
You make the projects actually economic. I mean, honestly, in our the first report when I was at EFI, we called this light at the end of the tunnel. And here's the explanation. It's not much different than nuclear. Is if you want to develop supply chains and expertise and manufacturing and consultants, if you want to have that entire industrial ecosystem supporting CO2 capture, you have to have kind of a predictable policy landscape, which we don't, we just proved. And what you have to have is you have to be able to show that if you get from the first of a kinds down to nth of a kind, you're going to have a long-term predictable level of support, right? So the goal is the first projects are going to hurt. They're going to be expensive, but you have light at the end of the tunnel. I know if I can drive the cost down so that, say today it works at $85, okay, I got a business. I can keep going in this business. I can employ people. I can make money. This is a great investment. But unless I see a way to get from first to nth, and once I'm at nth, a way that I get to run it forever and not have people say, oh, time to end the subsidy. Hey, yeah, you should be able to live on your own. Hi, we don't have a carbon price. Vaya con Dios, right? That doesn't work. You have to have the light at the end of the tunnel, and then you get investment. Otherwise, nobody in their right mind invests. Sorry.
All
Yeah,
right,
and
then.
just add a finer point on that. I mean, I think it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem, right? You need more projects to reduce costs. How do you get more projects? You know, you need support somehow. And I won't belabor that point because we've talked a lot about it, but more projects is essentially the answer.
All right, then, Jeff, I have another question for you right here. What assumption on storage efficiency goes into the cash from 45Q calculation on slide 2 of your presentation?
What storage efficiency?
What assumptions on storage efficiency go into the cash from 45Q calculation on your presentation?
Here I'm assuming storage efficiency basically 100%. The reason for that is if you, in the rules for the CO2 EOR pathway in the greenhouse gas reporting rules, you actually have to report carbon dioxide in, carbon dioxide produced, carbon dioxide reinjected. So first of all, if you're losing CO2, you don't collect the incentive. If you're talking about storage, there's many, the storage efficiency could be a bunch of things. But there's another version of what you would call efficiency is when you inject your first ton in, and it goes down and you produce oil, some comes back up and it keeps going in a loop. The typical retention of CO2 in the reservoir is about 50%. So actually, I inject a ton, only about a half ton comes up. I inject that half ton, only about a quarter. And eventually it ends up in the formation. And it's not magic that it ends up in the formation. There's little micropores, and basically the CO2 gets trapped in the roof of the micropore and it can't get out. And it becomes mineralized after a while. And you could refer to CO2, Suhavorka from the Texas Bureau of Economic Geology and UT Austin is the master of this. And there was a white paper in the original EFI research that Suhavorka wrote.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey. And our final question right here. None of the proposed rules granting Class 6 primacy to states mention climate change. Is that concerning to you at all?
Yeah, I can take that, Crystal. What I would say there is that different administrations, whether federal or state, they have different priorities. And as advocates, it's our job to meet them where they are, but to explain to them the impacts and benefits of the technology on the economy, global competitiveness, emissions reductions. And ultimately, this is a regulatory program designed to make sure that these regulations and rules meet or exceed the EPA standard. So I am not concerned that if the language in terms of the applications doesn't mention climate change, as long as it's still a very rigorous regulatory program that is protecting underground sources of drinking water and human health, because that's the goal of that program.
Right, it's a water pollution reg. It's not a climate change reg. It's how to keep the CO2 from bubbling up into the water system. So it doesn't need to have a purpose other than that.
All right, thank you very much for your answer right there. Now we've got about 5 minutes left of our session right here. So I want to ask each one of you, if you have one wrapping up idea, whether it be one takeaway that you would like people in the audience to have from your presentation, what's the one idea that you would want them to remember?
I guess I'll jump in and build upon something that Jesse said a couple minutes ago, that projects beget projects. There's a really critical role right now for the federal government to help advance this pioneering applications of what is a pretty well-established and mature technology. But these first applications in these higher emitting sectors are expensive. They are risky. And this is a role that the federal government can play, not just to help address climate change, but also to ensure long-term competitiveness, to think about how we meet growing demands on our grid, for example, where we need clean, firm power. As we move forward, we do need this strong role for the federal government, which then enables a longer-term pathway for states, for industry to really take over and be able to achieve that scale.
I'm happy to go. Preserving things like 45Q are whether or not the United States of America continues to lead for decades to come. Businesses need certainty. We need to offer them as much certainty as humanly possible so that we're able to build the energy that lets us win the modern races of our time, including AI. So to the extent possible, Congress needs to keep their foot on the pedal and keep moving in the right direction here. Otherwise, we're going to fall behind and we're going to fail and invest in technologies that we're going to need in 5 years. And we need today.
I can go next. I would just say, as I said before, it's clear that 45Q works. It's a strong market signal. We have according to the Global CCS Institute, more than 270 announced projects since the since the Future Act in 2018. A much narrower segment of those projects, as we saw earlier, are really moving forward towards commence construction. But so I totally echo what Christina says. We need to preserve the 45Q tax credit, preserve America's leadership position in this industry, because we really do risk ceding global leadership as other countries start to develop very rigorous policy frameworks around these technologies and advanced projects. And I think we also, as advocates in the industry, need to come together and think about what are the next steps, the next iteration of policy mechanisms to really see, to Michael and Jeff's point, the broader deployment across those high emitting sectors, that we really do want to capture emissions from going forward.
Crystal, I'd jump in and say, restore those grants for the first of a kind commercial demonstration projects and triple them. And the reason is simple: is the US has a wonderful record of doing good R&D and inventing things, then letting them be orphans and let other countries actually create them, which we did in batteries and solar. And we've invented a lot of these technologies at the R&D side, and in ARPA-E, and then we let them sit and we don't commercialize them. Let's have America be leaders for a change, instead of getting beaten out by Norway. I mean, I love Norway, but come on, guys. They've got 3 people in an oil well and, some lutefisk. Come on.
All right, then. Well, thank you all for your final thoughts. I would like to thank all of our panelists, Jeffrey, Jesse, Michael, Christina. Thank you all very much for coming and giving your insights on everything that we asked. Thank you very much to the EFI Foundation in general for their collaboration with us on this event. For anyone interested in learning more about the report, you can find it on this event's webpage, as well as on the EFI website. Thank you very much to our audience for taking the time to come out and hear more about this topic and contributing any questions to our discussion. If you would like to learn more about any of our upcoming events with USEA, you can find more on our website through the Consensus Program and subscribe for any of our newsletters and notifications on events. With that, I would like to wrap this up. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Take care and goodbye.